Tomorrow we have Ms. Priyadarshini Singh, doctoral student at School of Oriental and African Studies, speaking on Out of the Ballot Box, the role of political practices in Indian nations. And in the 8th, we have a young scholar from Presidency University, the newly founded Presidency University, the old Presidency College, Dr. Samal Mukherjee. The bones are probably of no value, unquote, the evaluation of Buddhist relics in colonial South Asia. On Monday, we begin our new public lecture series on Science, Society and Nature. Professor Kathleen D. Morrison, the University of Chicago, very leading anthropologist and archaeologist, the human face of the land, why the past matters for India's environmental future. And the weekly seminar next week on Tuesday at 3 p.m. Dr. Prashanta Chakravarti from the University of Delhi speaking on Hobbes the Heretic. On Thursday next week, we have Professor Varun Sani, JNU, speaking again in India and the wider world in the same series, problematizing the BRICS, Southern Hemisphere Grandeza, Northern Hemisphere Geopolitics. It's a great privilege and pleasure to welcome an old friend, Professor Rajen Harshe, who from 2005 to 2010 was the Vice Chancellor of the University of Allahabad. Professor Harshe recently became a visiting professor in the Department of International Relations at the newly founded South Asian University. It's very close to our campus, and I hope he will be making the journey here to Kingsley more often. Professor Harshe completed his doctorate from Jawaharlal Nehru University. He did part of his doctorate, I'm very sorry I can't pronounce this, so please forgive me, at the Foundation Nationale des Sciences Politiques from 1973 to 75. He was also a Fulbright scholar at Columbia University. He has very seminal and significant work. His scholarly contributions include The 20th Century Imperialism, Shifting Contours and Changing Perceptions, published in New Delhi, and his most recent work, Reflections on Nation Building, A Gypsy in the World of Ideas. He has published a huge number, last around 80 papers in rhetoric journals and anthologies. It seemed to us that Professor Harshe could have a choice of several menu of subjects on which he could enlighten us. But he also felt that looking at the larger subject of the relationship between India and Africa would be of special significance, not only for the past, but for the emerging future, both to the peoples of Africa and of India. Revisiting Indo-African ties in the 21st century, Professor Rajen.
Many thanks, Professor and Rajen. I must thank you for inviting me to deliver this talk. Several distinguished speakers have preceded me, and I'll only try to live up to your expectations, if you have any. When I decided to speak on this area, I thought that this could be slightly different, a bit offbeat, for audiences anywhere in India, surely they'll be as well. Otherwise, perhaps I would have myself gone on imperialism, globalization, several favorite areas with which I feel like saying something. The idea of speaking on Indo-African ties also gave me a chance to rethink what I must have been thinking in this area for some time. So that's how I decided to choose. Basically, I'll be talking about 21st century, but there will be departing points from where I will talk somewhere, and that would be end of the Cold War and 1991. Why? I would tell you the departing point is 1991 as the time progresses. Second thing that I would like to kind of state is that these are some of the important trends I am viewing. So rather than kind of concentrating on specifics, I am going to look at broader trends. Africa is too broad an area. So is India. So whole idea is somewhere to kind of give you glimpses of forest without losing the sight of trees. And that's how I thought I would speak. I organized my lecture in the following way. Initially, I would just say a few words on India's foreign policy prior to 91, subsequently as I perceive it or as it has been. Then come down directly to the brass tacks and speak about some major social realities that have been sweeping the continent of Africa. After that again I will discuss one broad area of security and security related issues between India and Africa. It would of course include energy security. And then something about trade, investment and development cooperation. So this is how I organized my talk. Now to start with some initial observations on India's foreign policy. One, that like any foreign policy, India's foreign policy has been absolutely dynamic. It has always negotiated with changing configurations of powers, whether in the Cold War phase or after. In the Cold War phase, India followed policy of non-alignment and decided to steer clear of power blocks led by the USA and the USSR. Partly this policy stemmed from India's unconventional attitude at looking at development itself, because you had a partially planned economy with parliamentary democracy. Somewhere Nehru was trying to synthesize liberty and equality in theoretical terms. Or somewhere he was posing a question that why accept the stereotypical alternatives like communism versus capitalism? Why this at all? These binary crude opposites. Can there be something like socialized capitalism coexisting with liberalized communism? I think that must have been the question. Otherwise, why this third way of developing oneself? And non-alignment became the reflection somewhere. It was also independent policy. India decided to judge every issue on its merit. There have been problems, of course. I would not go into it. It also meant somewhere that India wanted to exercise freedom of action in international relations. And as the time progressed somewhere, non-alignment not merely remained a policy, it became a broad strategy of several developing countries and eventually emerged as a subsystem or a movement in international relations after the Belgrade Conference of 1961. Non-alignment consistency, as I told you, responded to changes, and one of the important change was in Lusaka Conference of 1970, where non-aligned countries collectively thought that they have to alter structural imbalance in the world economy. Somewhere kind of economy is so heavily biased towards and heavily in favor of developed world that balance has to be altered, and somewhere developed, a more abundant world has to be kind of persuaded to share credit, technology, give favorable terms of trade and including prices with two developing countries. So Lusaka Conference of Non-Aligned Congress began to give economic dimension to the entire movement of non-alignment, and that continued for 20 more years. Somewhere, if you look at it, after 1991 when the Cold War was over, non-alignment could not have remained in the same form the way it did when the world was bipolar. It has continued perhaps. It has continued as a somewhat like one of our professors, Shishir Gupta, used to call it a trade union movement in the welfare state. I think that nature of non-alignment continued irrespective of times. That the people ritually gather, condemn imperialism, if it is not there, something else, condemn WTO, anything that condemn racism, apartheid. So somewhere is the forum where many countries and representatives of countries gather and think of developing world at large. At the same time, one has to also underline that India is no longer traditionally kind of developing economy or country. I will come to that slightly later, but one more quick point at 1991, which is a departing point, and that is demise of Soviet Union. And with Soviet Union, loss of an ally for India, loss of a very steady, comfortable market. I think somewhere India and the Soviet Union after 56, after Mahanovich model, and subsequently perhaps sustained each other's incompetence by giving incompetent goods to both. And that's how kind of, when incompetence meets and mediocrity meets, is beautiful because there is so much harmony always. There's lack of harmony when something odd strikes you in life. But that's, erratic comments apart. somewhere there is no ally to buy your goods. That's very important. And subsequently, a crisis was brewing in India, and that crisis was so heavy in terms of foreign exchange reserve. Somewhere the foreign exchange reserve had depleted to a point where $1 billion was only left with us, with India, and it was difficult to buy or make provisions for imports. Economy was in a very sad shape as far as India is concerned. And I recall those years, 1989, 1991, I think country didn't work at all. All the time something was happening and agitations were constantly brewing, and country not working suits Indians. This is something very interesting. That like Mahatma Gandhi also became Subhash Chandra Bose asking for independence by asking them blood. And Indians didn't cooperate. The movement Mahatma Gandhi said non-cooperation, give up jobs, don't go to schools, colleges, give up working. There's a mass movement kind of coming up in India. And this is something so characteristic of this country. But its survival also does something fantastic. That's also another part. But anyway, 91, the situation was simple. I would say the fiscal deficit at the rate of 8.3% GDP. There was also a current account deficit 2.2% of the GDP, 17% inflation. Money was also going away on salaries and subsidies. Indians are always used to spending in public sector anyway. Any university kind of balance sheet, if you see 90% of the money goes in salaries. Any public sector, it could not be any different. Point is that this was the economy was really in crisis. And somewhere I would say that India went for reforms. And a very major point I would like to make, that India went for reforms out of compulsion and out of no conviction. So many times when India is accused of being neoliberal out of conviction, not really any conviction was there of any kind of this. But still, there are always, debates of, if I am pardoned for my, anyway, I will not crack the joke. I will go ahead. Because it should not happen that the seriousness is lost. But point is very simple, that we should think about it as what it was. And I would say India went for reforms under dire circumstances. And most important part was that India was spending huge amounts on salaries and subsidies. There were unsustainable fiscal deficits, and public sectors were malfunctioning and mismanaged, and that is when reforms became essential. So reforms basically were meant for perhaps rectifying this, perhaps in privatizing public sector units which were malfunctioning, perhaps cutting the amount on salaries and subsidies, integrating economy of India with the world economy. So far we had partial integration with or selective participation in the world economy. Now Indians wanted to integrate themselves fully with the world economy, and that is very important part. And of course to tide over the balance of payment crisis which was immediate, and also to kind of add up to foreign exchange reserves, and all this package kind of became so-called reform package, so-called liberalization agenda, which was dubbed by many as neoliberal, as something, whatever you kind of see all these words in every part, and that's how it was characterized, but I don't agree with it necessarily. It was out of compulsion India was going through it, and reforms became essential because of mismanagement of earlier economy. As India was doing this reform, somewhere India had to redefine, rework its relationship with the world at large, whether it is United States, post-Soviet Russia, European Union, China, Southeast Asian countries, Rupees policy, and of course Sub-Saharan Africa. So I think this has been the process. There are some domestic policies changing. Domestically, India is kind of trying to rearrange, rework relationship between market, state, and civil society. And there is nothing like market versus state. Actually, many times, market can be also production of state itself. Market is not rival or alternative to the state. State can work out the nature of market. That's how they have always been. Polanyi had given this argument many years ago. But I don't see them as binaries as much as market and state plus civil society, and somewhere country had to be managed. If civil society was not participating in developing process, an entire kind of work was given to state at large, then they wanted to unburden state with the responsibilities. my fifth point is, and that is very major but simple, that India has already become, but by now most certainly it is evident, it is middle ranking or middle ranging power in the world economy. Somewhere India surely looks like, and indeed is, developed among many developing countries. And it is also developing perhaps among developed countries of West Europe and North America. So somewhere it's a kind of, many times I've always tried to fit countries, periphery, semi-periphery, core, and India does come over periphery perhaps most certainly, and near, and somewhere periphery or emerging economy. And that has to be kind of borne in mind. So if this is India, that it has a size, technology, manpower, ICT revolution, burgeoning middle class, intelligentsia, gamut of universities, and also vibrant media, democratic polity, this India, how will it relate to Africa? That's the second question. I would then straight away plunge into putting across certain major realities that have been constituting Africa. Again, there is a kind of simple point that I would like to cut across, that African continent has 53 countries. And to kind of talk about 53 countries at one go would be very difficult. One should not even do it. I am not as bold to do it also. Because all these countries differ in terms of their geographical size, social composition, colonial past, levels of economic development, types of political regimes, strategies of development, and it would be kind of worth our while to take a differentiated view of all these countries. And I am not treating Africa as homogeneous unit at all. Just the way I don't treat India as homogeneous unit. It's heterogeneous. And this India is relating to Africa. There is also why I would like to kind of mention that somewhere are certain trends which India and Africa are witnessing are common. And I come down to the kind of first trend, and that is of globalization. I think this particular reality is affected all the world. Again, I kind of make 1991 as my departing point for a simple reason. Like my friends like Rajen, they have talked about globalization much before. Sometimes people consider kind of Vasco da Gama's coming to India, Columbus is going to United States or discovering America as departing point to see what is globalization. I am using 1991 for a very simple reason, that the Soviet Union collapsed and capitalism did not have any formidable developmental alternative. So somewhere this particular phase of globalization is linked with capitalism and development of capitalism in a peculiar way. If you kind of think of it, globalization somewhere signifies complex and multi-layered processes which are simultaneously at work. So you can anticipate free flow of goods, capital, services, finance, free flow of knowledge and ideas, free flow of drugs and terror and many other things. So this is one area where kind of barriers are getting broken, and thanks to ICT revolutions, world is kind of getting nearer, and we can conceive of world as a single unit under globalization. It is of course linked to capitalism, as I told earlier, and I would like to say capitalism perhaps is a system still in the making, and somewhere if you want to identify salient features, private or corporate ownership of the means of production, socialization of production but privatization of profits somewhere, conflictual as well as cooperative relationship between wage labor and capital, and capacity to accumulate capital or surplus on the world scale. All these define the system called capitalism, a social organization called capitalism. Capitalism and globalization are inextricably intertwined, but I would not reduce globalization to capitalism. They are interconnected. Perhaps capitalism is agent of globalization also, but they are not reducible. I would also like to say one more quick thing before I move, and that is, since capitalism has no developmental alternative, you can look at China also after 1978. It has perhaps been methodically building capitalism under the garb of market socialism. Somewhere the rise of state-owned enterprises in China is a unique development, And China Mobile Company, for example, if it has 600 or 6 to 700 million subscribers, I think this has to be looked into. If China stock market has to look into. And development of China also has suffered inequalities between regions, sectors, and that also needs to be looked into. I would also like to say that if this particular trend of globalization, of which capitalism is part or vice versa, African countries also witness this, and the so-called Afro-Marxist countries like Angola, Mozambique, Ethiopia of the Eastern years, they gave up somewhere the socialist path of development at one stage. It was very strange that whatever they were socialist at any point, one can never say. I just give you one neat example to kind of drive home a point. Angola is a minerally wealthy country. It has oil. And that oil of Angola was being constantly exploited by American companies, Gulf company in particular, but Chevron oil, every other company was there. Out of extraction of oil, Angola used to earn revenues. And revenues earned by Angola out of oil, Angola used to purchase weapons from the Soviet Union. And subsequently, Angolans had also hired 50,000 Cuban mercenaries to fight a civil war in the country. So Americans kind of giving you revenues, Russians giving you arms, and Cubans give you mercenaries. And somewhere there's something like, finance capital was at the base and socialism remained at the superstructure. So we can even question what kind of Afro-Marxism it was. Mozambique, of course, was another country, and then you have Ethiopia. I would also like to say a few quick things. That South Africa also changed itself. African National Congress and his agenda was they wanted to be socialist. Mandela was very concerned about it. But as 1994, Africa became free of apartheid regime, I think first thing that the ANC worked for was liberalizing economy, extending the role of private sector, thinking of reform. All this began. I would also say that somewhere this was a necessity. We can't sit on a value judgment. I remember Robert Mugabe once upon a time was a Marxist-Leninist when Zimbabwe became free. And after that, when Zimbabwe attained independence, Zimbabwe's currency was linked to sterling pounds, and they invited foreign investors. And someone asked him, well, you were talking Marxist language, and what are you doing now? Then Robert Mugabe said that Marx had to sit in the library in London and write about capital. I have to run the state, and that's the difference. So I have to do things which are different. And this you have to bear in mind that on paper what exists may not exist in reality. African countries then, they're facing globalization, but there are certain kinds of constraints many countries have: poor infrastructure, poor expenditure on health and education, institutional decay. And in that, how will they achieve high growth to reduce poverty? I see connection between growth and poverty. I see connection between growth and development. Although it's easy to work out that growth is quantitative and development is qualitative. And you require development means total upliftment of a social system where you have enlargement of franchise, you have reduction of economic and social inequalities. But somewhere growth is necessary to launch development. And in African countries, organizations like African Business Roundtable are moving ahead to see reform agenda is successful. Private sector is being encouraged, investments are mounting, resource-rich countries are flooded with investments. I would only like to say here that if African countries are under the spell of globalization and reforms, somewhere certain countries which are oil-rich countries seem to have done slightly better than other countries. Countries like Nigeria, South Africa, the resource-rich country, uranium, platinum, gold, diamonds, it has been doing well. Libya also did quite well. So did the Sudan. I'll come to Sudan later. Angola also. But there are certain countries which are not so resource-rich or naturally endowed, like Benin or Mali or Madagascar. Their capital inflows are not as high in such countries as before. My second point is Africa also has been struck by the wave of democracy. And by democracy I mean representative institutions and their work. Representative institutions. somewhere I would also like to insist that the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, or the so-called Marshall Aid Program of Group of 8 countries, which was launched by Canada, all these countries were trying to see that human rights are protected in different parts of Africa, and there is a history of violation of human rights in Africa, and it is anywhere. Why should one signal out Africa and say there is a history of violation? But anyway, Dada Idi Amin was there in Africa and Uganda, who was known for violating human rights. You have Pol Pot in Cambodia and Pinochet in Chile. So there is no particular kind of regime or particular continent that violates human rights. But anyway, human rights have to be protected, and that's why democratic regimes, it is believed, or the kind of so do international financial institutions believe, that if there are democratic regimes, then such rights can be protected. And that's why aid was tied up with representative democracy or elections, and also structural adjustment programs. So some of the countries like Nigeria, Ghana, Burkina Faso, Uganda, Zimbabwe, they went through elections. So did Ivory Coast, Kenya, Zambia, Gabon. There is a wave of them, Senegal. And this wave of democracy, somewhere I would not say all elections are free and fair. It would be a very stupid statement to make. Elections may have been rigged. But still, there is a semblance of democracy, and transfer of power was apparently through democratic means. That is the point that I am making. Between 1988 to 96, for instance, only in 8 countries there was smooth transition, like Zambia, Malawi, Madagascar, South Africa, smooth transition. But by and large, the authoritarian past has been there in Africa with many countries, and they are there in North African countries as well. Sometimes you could see it when in Tunisia they rebelled against Ali's regime, or in Mubarak's regime in Egypt was also attacked by Jasmine revolution. So was Gaddafi subsequently. And if you look at all these revolutions somewhere, I think Gaddafi particularly, India, China and Russia did not take any straightforward position. In fact, India was cautious. It didn't want to interfere or intervene in the domestic matters of all these countries at one level. Partly because it was also conscious of the fact that somewhere it has to protect, or it has its own problems at hand, whether it's Northeast, Kashmir, and it has also sensibilities of minority communities, Muslim minorities, to see and look after. So there is no clear stand as much as non-interference, but the United Nations collectively can work out some concerted action in all these oil-rich countries. That's how India kind of was working for. And this is important to my mind, because somewhere India, except for once in Portuguese Guinea's liberation, where Indira Gandhi recognized that provisional government and decided to support it, India always differed, whether it's Algeria, whether it's Sahara, or whether internal rebellions in Tunisia, Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt and Libya. I would also like to say another point, an important point again, that all these countries in Africa, the states are under severe strain. And this is happening under globalization to many parts of the world. But states in Africa have been particularly fragile in the sense that 1885 and Berlin Conference brought them into being, and in one state there are several ethnic nationalities. This is a common reality in Africa. So entire kind of continent of Africa somewhere has been plagued by civil wars. There have been exceptional cases like Namibia was 5th province of South Africa, but it was under United Nations referendum, it was liberated, it became free. Eritrea fought civil war with Ethiopia, today under UN auspices it became free. So Southern Sudan today is independent country. But the violent secessionist movement took place. In Katanga and subsequently Shaba province there was some kind of chance of secession. Rwanda and Burundi, if you mention a country, you can see the state is constantly under strain. When African countries, like many plural societies, or perhaps fashionable multicultural societies, they are not able to manage different communities and groups together and governance together. Because governance somewhere involves balance between autonomy and accountability, and they are not able to manage it. In South Africa, perhaps they were able to manage. If you look at Nelson Mandela's autobiography also, you can see that this man was a visionary, and he had also notions of rainbow coalition in his mind all the time. And somewhere, kind of, if it is a rainbow coalition and where you can conceive of something like Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It's a unique experiment at one level. Critics say otherwise, but unique experiment because we are victims coming to kind of, perpetrators of injustice, and people who perpetrated that injustice apologize for what happened. And then forget and forgive was the word, and that's why kind of they try to bind communities. This is a unique experiment in the history, and that happened in South Africa. Whether one can draw from it or not needs to be seen. There are many such things that happen in India. I will just quickly make one point, that just as nations are built on collective memory, they can be also built on selective amnesia. They can forget unpleasant things of the past and be together always. That's how things can happen better. Another point that I would like to quickly make is that like regionalization is response to globalization all over the world. In Africa also region and constitution of region is a strong reality. South African Development Community, a region which has come up because of South Africa's premier position. Economic Community of West Africa and Nigeria. So many regions are getting constituted and reconstituted. And another important point about regions, Africa has unique continent-wide organization. Earlier it was Organization of African Unity, and today it is African Union. A very unique organization which binds all countries together. And earlier the Organization of African Unity stood for non-interference in each other's affairs, but today there is something like African interventionist force, and suppose human rights are affected, African interventionist force can play a role. It can play a role in civil wars also. And looking at child soldiers or drug trafficking or illicit and small arms trade, I think somewhere AU can make important efforts. And last point in this realities I would like to make is, apart from erstwhile colonial powers, they are not as significant in Africa today as countries like India and China. So two emerging economies, two important middle-ranging powers are important powers today in Africa. China, of course, is much more so, and under no conditions I want to bring any comparison between China and India at all. So that's a different area of debate. I will come down to the third area after discussing social realities in Africa, and that is what are the shared political and security concerns between India and Africa. My first point is, if you look at several African countries, a large number of their people were trained in National Defense Academy, Khadagpatla, and so many Nigerian president was trained there. I would forget the name, not able to. Yes, Obafemi, yes. And so many people are trained in Indian Academy, and so many of them have studied in Delhi University, in Pune, and so many parts. So that is one bond, and security-related areas have drawn training from India. Similarly, India was concerned about the people of Indian origin in these parts. And they are plentiful all over in Southern Africa, in East Africa, what we call diasporic Indians. Only Dada Idi Amin drove them out in 73, and that's where that issue kind of became important. Otherwise, this is very important. And from the security point of view, if you look at it, somewhere, when United Nations interventions took place in civil wars, India was a very important country which participated in, I think, bringing humanitarian aid, Red Cross assistance, or peacekeeping operations. And important countries are, of course, Somalia, Democratic Republic of Congo, Mozambique, Rwanda, Liberia, Sudan, wherever, even Namibia, India did a lot there. India has done something for decolonization. It has fought against apartheid too. But today the most significant area, in my view, from the security point of view, has been the entire Indian Ocean region. I think that India, after kind of globalization, and as more and more it is integrating itself in the world economy, and more it is kind of building up its naval power. Somewhere it is an important trading nation and seafaring nation. And trade between India and African countries has been on the rising. I'll come to those figures in a minute. But this area from Suez Canal to Malacca Strait, in between the Cape of Good Hope, this is very, very significant area. These international waterways are important. In fact, in 1967 war, when Arab-Israeli war in 1967, when Suez Canal could not carry large oil tankers, the tankers had to go via the Cape of Good Hope, and that's how West Asian countries and Europe kept in touch with each other. So Cape of Good Hope, the Vasco da Gama way, is a very important way to communicate, and it can lead us to many other parts of Africa as well as perhaps even Latin America. And so, being a seafaring nation, Indian Ocean countries are important, and that point I want to just drive home. Among the African countries, if you look at trade, it is quite significant with Nigeria and South Africa. And I'll come to come to it little later, but as far as security part is concerned, somewhere non-traditional security is also important, and organization of transnational crime which is taking place in parts of India and Africa. Somewhere this requires our attention, because India is located between the so-called Golden Triangle and Golden Crescent, Northwest Asia and Southeast Asia, and it has already become a hub for drug trade, a transit hub for drug trade. And drug trade is something where consumers, people who refine and produce, they are located differently. So it's a hub for drug trade, and in somewhere Goa or Rajasthan, people have been caught up African origin who are indulging in such trade, and that's an important point that I would like to drive home right now. Second important thing, as far as security is concerned, energy security is very important, and oil particularly. India is an energy hungry economy like China, and India should draw a great deal from Persian Gulf countries. But today, Nigeria, Angola and Sudan, they are important oil partners of India. In fact, India desperately needs to diversify its oil sources, import of oil. And as far as Nigeria is concerned, India already has built blocks. Mittal is going there. As far as Angola is concerned, again, India is importing oil from Angola. And in Sudan, there is a direct involvement. ONGC, Pradesh, OVL, OMEL and Mittal, natural gas and Organization of Natural Oil and Natural Gas Corporation of India is operating there. Initially, it invested $750 million, and now the investments have gone up. Sandeepan is here, he will tell you exact figures, but the total give and take between Nigeria, India and Sudan is to the tune of $3 billion. And somewhere India and Sudan, South share many things in common, but Sudan has been divided now. It's a partition country, and South Sudan and North Sudan, there are 500 miles of boundary, and refineries are located in North, production is in the South, and somewhere this relationship India will have to work out between two halves of Sudan, because already Mahindra, Kirloskar, L&T, they are all part of Sudanese commercial landscape and market. India's trade with Africa has increased consistently. I am coming to some economic issues. In 1991, it was only $967 million. And today, in 2008-9, it was $40 billion. And by 2015, it could be $70 billion. Something remarkable in terms of a rise in trade. Partly Focus Africa program is responsible for it. 2002 it was initiated. India initially started focusing on Anglophone African countries, but by now Focus Africa program has 22 countries, and India is trading with several countries by showing exhibitions like Made in India. It is also giving loans of advancing credit for import-export in Africa, and different projects are being taken. And Indo-African Summit of 2008 in Delhi, I think, gave a great boost to this program, because 33 states were present from Africa. It is not comparable with China. China had so many more. Here only 8 presidents came. But nonetheless, it gave a great deal of boost. India gave 1,600 fellowships to African students. Then power sector, infrastructure, and several areas that collaboration began, including the new economic partnership for development, the Nepal program of Africa. I think Thabo Mbeki, the South African president, talked of African Renaissance, and this particular thing has been constantly supported by India, and that's how this collaboration is occurring. In 2011, again, Indo-African Summit took place in Nigeria, and there also 15 countries met and this collaboration is going on. All the money doesn't get spent, but trade is getting boost, investments are getting boost, and connections are getting built. Made in India, products are shown everywhere. People like Narayan Murthy have gone across to show how ICT powerful Infosys or Wipro, other companies of India are, and somewhere things are moving, and India has also advanced loan of $200 million to Nepal. I would like to say there are several educational institutes which are coming up and which are important in my view. Like we have Institute of Foreign Trade in Delhi. They are establishing India-Africa Institute for Foreign Trade. You have India-Africa Diamond Institute, again model on this somewhere. Small scale and medium scale industries are also entering in Africa. You have NUPA's counterpart, National Educational University of Planning and Administration counterpart in Africa also, India-Africa Institute. Then India-Africa Information Technology University, that is also coming up. India and Africa are also collaborating in pharma industry, particularly AIDS is a very severe problem in Africa. More than 30 million people are stuck with AIDS and HIV, and they require drugs which are relatively cheap and less costly than what multinational firms offer, and India perhaps is capable of offering such drugs at the prices which are comparatively better acceptable. Last point that I would like to make is both India and Africa, they have sizable number of young people, and it's a young people's continent, whether it's India or Africa. Many times as educationists, I am always wondering and worrying that this country will have something like 500 million youngsters by 2020, and then will we provide them institutions of higher learning like university or institutes to see that they are absorbed, and if they are not, will they turn terrorists? I think Africa also somewhere has a similar kind of problem. Somewhere we have to kind of wake up to the call or to the reality that India is young. In fact, being a teacher all my life, I have lived with several kind of phases of my life. And now I can be slightly semi-serious and sarcastic. I can say that the Partha Ghosh is sitting in front of us. We both studied at one stage at the People's Republic of JNU. And from there, I went over to kind of teach in different universities, and I teach even today. Why I said it? Because after the batch which I am teaching today, they are born after 1991. And they are born in era where there are reforms. So their problems are different. They want governance, they want security, they want opportunities, they want something else. And they are not tied up with the erstwhile debate. They belong to nearly 21st century and not the past century. And we have to think of these young people, and 21st century belongs to them. And that's how new contours of India and Africa and their collaboration in trade, investment, development, military, and every other related area, including geopolitics and strategy, will get worked out. I think thank you ever so much for bearing with me, and thank you, Professor Rajen, for giving me this opportunity. I meant no harm to everybody if I did crack a joke, but it was only to keep your attention going, otherwise lectures can get drastic. Thank you.